Welcome to The Explainer, where we unpack the big ideas for really important sources. Today, we are getting into political scientist John Mearsheimer's book, The Great Delusion. Okay, let's jump right in. So, Mearsheimer kicks off his book with this huge puzzle. He's looking at the world after the Cold War, right? The United States was, without a doubt, the most powerful country on the planet, and everyone was optimistic. So why, he asks, did its foreign policy lead to so many disasters, from the Middle East to its crumbling relationship with Russia? He really wanted to get to the bottom of what went wrong. To really get his answer, we have to first wrap our heads around the specific moment in history he's talking about. We're talking about a time of just unprecedented American power. Okay, so the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. Suddenly, the US is the only superpower left standing, and the foreign policy establishment had this grand idea. They could basically remake the entire world in America's own liberal democratic image. This whole strategy was called liberal hegemony. The goal? A global open economy, strong international institutions, and, turning as many countries as possible into democracies just like them. A key question, right? Was this incredibly ambitious plan doomed from the start? Well, according to Mearsheimer, the answer is a resounding yes. He argues that this whole strategy was on a collision course with some much, much more powerful forces. And to see why, we need to dig into what he calls the three fundamental isms of international politics. He basically says that all of international politics, the whole shebang, comes down to how these three core ideas interact with each other. So let's break them down one by one. First up, we have political liberalism. At its very core, this idea is all about the individual. It says that every single person on this planet is born with certain rights that can't be taken away, inalienable rights. And, this is key, it sees these rights as universal. That belief is exactly what pushes liberal countries to try and change the world. Second, there's nationalism. Now, this is an incredibly powerful force. It's the belief that the world is naturally divided into these distinct groups, nations. Each one has its own unique culture, its own identity, and a really deep desire to be in charge of its own fate. Mearsheimer argues that for most people, loyalty to their nation, it trumps almost everything else. And third, we have realism. This theory looks at the world and says, hey, it's a state of anarchy out here. Now, that doesn't mean total chaos. It just means there's no world government, there's no global 911 you can call when you're in trouble. And because of that, states have no choice but to compete with each other for power, simply to guarantee their own survival. So, this is where it gets really interesting. What happens when these three isms start bumping into each other on the world stage? Mearsheimer's central argument is that America's liberal foreign policy was a failure precisely because it clashed head-on with those other two much more powerful forces. So let's look at the first big clash, liberalism versus nationalism. Liberalism is all about universalism. It says your rights are my rights no matter where we live. But nationalism, it's what we call particularist. It says, nope, we care way more about the people in our own group, our own nation. So when a liberal superpower tries to meddle in another country's business, even for a good cause, nationalism almost always ignites some fierce resistance. And then you've got the second big clash, this time with realism. Liberalism's goal is to create peace by spreading democracy. But other big countries, they don't see it that way at all. They're operating on realist logic. So they don't see some noble crusade for democracy. No, they see a strategic threat. They see another power trying to get new allies, trying to tip the balance of power, and ultimately trying to threaten their own security. And here is the absolute bottom line for Mearsheimer. When these forces collide, nationalism and realism almost always come out on top. Why? Because he argues they're just more in tune with basic human nature, which he sees as deeply social and tribal. We seem to be hardwired to be loyal to our group and to be wary of outside threats. Liberalism, with its focus on the abstract individual, just doesn't have that same kind of raw, primal power. Now, according to the book, this predictable failure of liberal hegemony isn't just some quiet academic point. It comes with some really steep costs, both for the rest of the world and, ironically, for the liberal country itself. Chasing this policy, he says, leads to a whole waterfall of bad outcomes. You've got constant military interventions, which end up destabilizing huge regions like the Middle East. You get other major powers like Russia and China feeling threatened and pushing back. And you start chipping away at this core idea of state sovereignty, the principle that countries shouldn't interfere in each other's internal affairs. And Mearsheimer is very specific about the military part. He points out that between the end of the Cold War and when he published his book, the United States fought in 7 different wars. The policy, he argues, basically makes a country addicted to war. And here's the real kicker. The book argues that this kind of militaristic foreign policy always leads to a more powerful national security state back home. And what does that state run on? Secrecy and surveillance, the very things that eat away at the individual rights and civil liberties that liberalism was supposed to be about in the first place. All right, so if liberal hegemony is the big problem, what's Mearsheimer's solution? What's his prescription for a smarter, more effective foreign policy? He pushes for something he calls restraint. And this approach is built entirely on the logic of realism, not liberalism. The goal isn't to go out and change the world. It's to protect your country's vital interests. War is no longer a crusade. It's just a tool, a last resort that you only use when you absolutely have to in order to maintain the balance of power. And the expected result of all this? Way fewer wars. So what does this actually look like? It would mean the U.S. would only use its military when its core national interests are directly threatened by another great power, and only in a few strategically vital regions of the world. It means giving up on the whole project of nation building and regime change. At the end of the day, Mearsheimer concludes that this isn't some cynical retreat from the world. It's actually a deeply pragmatic move. By finally understanding and respecting the power of nationalism and realism, a great power can get more security and more stability, but with way fewer wars and at a much lower cost. Of course, this debate over America's role in the world is far from over, but The Great Delusion gives us a really powerful, if controversial, framework for understanding why all that optimism after the Cold War just fizzled out into an age of endless conflict. And it leaves us with a really critical question to think about.